Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 25, Jean Matthew Philibert Serurier, Marshal.
After 34 years' service to be still a captain, with no probable chance of promotion, such was the lot of Serurier when the Revolution broke out in 1789. Born on December 8, 1742, he had received his first commission in the militia at the age of 13, and from there had been transferred to the line. His war service was not inconsiderable, including 3 campaigns in Hanover, 1 in Portugal, and 1 in Italy. He had been wounded as far back as the action of Wartburg in 1760, but there was no court influence to bring him his majority. With the Revolution, however, fortune quickly changed. The years of steady attention to duty, of patient devotion to, and loving care of his men brought their reward. And when promotion became the gift of the soldiers and not of the courtiers, the stern old disciplinarian found himself at the head of his regiment. In the hand-to-hand struggles which distinguished the early campaigns in the Alps, he soon acquired a reputation for bravery and the clever handling of his men. By June 1795, he had risen to be general of division, in which capacity he distinguished himself on July 7th by the way he led his division at the fight for the Col de Tenda, and for the modesty with which he attributed all his success to his soldiers. A month later, he saved the whole army at the Col de Pierre-Étroit, when under the cover of driving rain and mist, the enemy surprised the French line of piquets at midnight and had all but seized the position. It was Serurier who, collecting 350 men, hurled himself against the enemy's column of 1,500 bayonets, and by sheer hand-to-hand fighting held them in check for 6 hours, and at last repulsed them with the loss of a considerable number of prisoners. With the halo of this action still surrounding him, in March 1796, he first came into direct connection with Bonaparte. The new commander-in-chief quickly took measure of his tall, stern subordinate. While recognizing to the full his bravery, the excellent discipline he knew how to maintain, and the high regard in which he was held by his division, he saw that the iron of years of subordination had entered into the old soldier's soul, and that, while he could be relied on to obey orders implicitly, he never could be trusted with an independent command. Still, what Bonaparte most required from his subordinates was immediate obedience and speedy performance of orders, and consequently, Serurier played no insignificant part in the glorious campaign of 1796. At Mondovi, he showed his stubbornness when the Sardinian general turned at bay, and, as Bonaparte wrote to the Directory, the victory was due entirely to Serurier. When the Austrians were driven into Mantua, Bonaparte entrusted him with the siege. The Austrian forces in the fortress numbered some 14,000. Serurier had but 10,000 to carry on the siege, although the usual estimate is that a besieging force should be 3 times as strong as the besieged. But by his clever use of the marshes and bridges, he was able to hold the enemy and open his trenches and siege batteries. It was no fault of his that, on the advance of Wurmser, he had to abandon his guns and hasten to Castiglione, for Bonaparte had given him no warning of the sudden advance of the Austrian relieving force. After Castiglione, he returned to his task round Mantua and gallantly repulsed all sorties. When the end came, he had the honor of superintending the surrender and of receiving the parole from the gallant old Marshal Wurmser and the Austrian officers. In the advance on Vienna, his division distinguished itself in the terrible march to Assola, but, as Bonaparte said, the wind and the rain were always the crown of victory for the army of Italy. At Gradisca, Serurier captured 2,500 prisoners, 8 stands of colors, and 10 pieces of artillery, and again crowned himself with glory at the Col de Tarvis. In June, Bonaparte sent the old warrior to Paris to present 22 captured stands to the Directory, and in his dispatches, after enumerating his triumphs from Mondovi to Gradisca, he finished by saying, "General Serurier is extremely severe on himself, and at times on others. A stern enforcer of discipline, order, and the most necessary virtues for the maintenance of society, he disdains intrigues and intriguers." He then proceeded to demand for him the command of the troops of the Cisalpine Republic. But the directors had other designs and sent back the general to command the captured province of Venice. In 1799, when the Austrians and Russians invaded northern Italy, Serurier commanded a division of the Army of Occupation. During the operations which ended in the enemy forcing the Adda, his division got isolated from the main body. The old soldier, whose boast was that he never turned his back on an enemy, forgetful of strategy, and thinking only of honor, instead of attempting to escape and rejoin the rest of the army, took possession of an extremely strong position at Verderio, and soon found himself surrounded. After a gallant fight against an enemy 3 times his number, he was compelled to surrender with 7,000 men. The celebrated Suvorov, the Russian commander, treated him with great kindness and invited him to dine. After his exchange on parole had been arranged, the Russian general asked him where he was going. "To Paris." "So much the better," replied Suvorov. "I shall count on seeing you there soon." "I have myself always hoped to see you there," replied Serurier with considerable wit and dignity. The general was still a prisoner on parole when Bonaparte returned from Egypt, and at once gladly placed himself at his disposal and aided him during the coup d'état of Brumaire. It was because of this service, and of the strong affection which the old warrior bore him, that Bonaparte piled honors upon him, for Serurier had undoubtedly done less than anybody, save perhaps Bessières, to deserve his baton. Still, Napoleon knew his devotion, his blind obedience to orders, and his absolute integrity. In December 1799, he called him to the Senate. In April 1804, he made him governor of the Invalides, and a month later presented him with his marshal's baton, and created him Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor and Grand Cross of the Iron Crown. But he never employed him in the field, though once for a short time during the Walcheren expedition, he placed him in command of the National Guard of Paris. The old marshal found a congenial occupation in looking after the veterans at the Invalides, while, as vice president of the Senate, he faithfully served the interests of his beloved emperor. When in 1814 he heard that Paris was going to surrender, rather than that the trophies of his master's glory should fall into the hands of the enemy, on the night of March 30th, he collected the 1,800 captured standards which adorned Notre Dame, and the military trophies from the chapel of the Invalides, and burned them, and he actually hurled into the fire the sword of the great Frederick, which had been seized in 1806 at Potsdam. Yet in spite of his devotion to the emperor, a few days later he took part in the proceedings in the Senate and voted for his deposition. Under the Restoration, he was made a peer of France, but on Napoleon's return he hastened to greet him. But the emperor could not forgive his desertion, and thinking he would not benefit by his services, he refused them. When the Bourbons returned a second time, the marshal was stripped of his titles and, what caused him more grief, of his command of the Invalid. After parting from the veterans, whose welfare he had so long superintended, the old warrior withdrew into private life and died at Paris on December 21st, 1819, at the age of 77.
This concludes Chapter 25 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 26 about Joseph Poniatowski. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.